obvious, and you're going to laugh at me for being so stupid, but I'm going to say it anyway. What scientific management does is make management seem scientific. Okay? It literally does what it says. That is to say that management now was not about simply the handling of workers. It wasn't based in a set of personal relationships. It wasn't even necessarily based in a system of work discipline. It was based in scientific systems. Okay, so the worker is now positioned basically as an object of a new labour process that is scientific and therefore is hard to refute, hard to contest. Now, the classic example of the type of scientific mass production that this new breed of management has is, of course, the Ford Motor Company. And the Ford Motor Company opens its first plant in Britain, in Trafford Park. If any of you are followers of Manchester United, it's Man United play at Old Trafford, right next to Trafford Park. And it opens in 1913, and it opens there because Trafford Park has access to electrical power. A working class writer known as Walter Greenwood writes this account of his experience working in the Ford plant at Trafford in the 1920s. This is a factional account. When an employee of the motor works passed through the works gates to the clocking on machines, he stepped from Britain into Detroit, where Moloch, in the shape of the mainline assembly, held an unrelenting sway. Parallel tracks down the central aisles of the main shop's length crept forward at a preset pace. Tributary feeder tracks at angles conveniently placed and moving at synchronized speed delivered the prefabricated bits and pieces to the servitors who had to be at their station along the lines the moment that the klaxon blared its imperious and ear-lacerating dissonance. And there the workers stayed, each performing his repetitive operation until the hooter screamed again, signalling the half-hour midday break and the mad rush into the street, rain or shine, to bolt a lunch and devour a cigarette before the siren's discord recalled the hirelings to the paralysing monotony of the endless afternoon. Okay? This is Chaplin's modern times. Yeah? This is the classic account of the dehumanising nature of Fordist mass production. Now, Britain thought it had an answer to this problem, okay? That scientific management could be humanised. It didn't have to. It didn't have to turn workers into hirelings or into servitors or into functionaries. And of course, the British way of scientific management was in many ways pioneered by your old friend Seaborn Rowntree at the Ministry of Munitions during the First World War. What this approach did was to place the emphasis on the welfare of the worker, on what was called the human factor, that you invest in the human being, you try and provide forms of welfare that will make them more efficient. Okay, you don't treat them like machines. And following the First World War, there were a whole series of organisations set up to continue the type of experimental work that Rowntree had done at the Ministry of Munitions. The Industrial Fatigue Research Board in 1918, the Industrial Welfare Society in the same year, and the National Institute of Industrial Psychology in 1921. In many ways, what these organisations did was Sure, they wanted to make workers more efficient and more productive, but that also represented a continuation of that new social contract between management and workers that had been so provisionally outlined in the First World War. The idea that workers were in a position to demand welfare and to have rights in the workplace. Now, I don't want you to think that every factory is embracing these methods. It remains very much a marginal fringe pursuit for many employees through the 1920s and 1930s. The first thing that happens when you hit an economic downturn is if you're looking to make cuts, you make cuts in precisely these types of areas. Neither do I want you to think that scientific management is just something that happens in a factory. This is not just about Fordist forms of production. It also becomes an integral part of the household. And the best example here, of course, is the development of domestic science and its styling of the new efficient labour-saving home. Okay? I talked to you about the Ideals Homes exhibition last week. The Ideals Homes exhibition was full of stalls showcasing labour-saving equipment that would enable women to do their domestic work faster, and efficient kitchens and cleaning spaces. And indeed, cookery books and domestic science manuals, rather like Mrs. Beeton, but in a new scientific way, showed women how they should organise the daily routines of housework. The University of London, King's College, even created its own department of household and social science. And that coupling of household and social science is important, okay? Because household management, domestic science, was seen to be an essential part of improving the condition of society, which was what the object of the social sciences were. Which brings me seamlessly on to the big social sciences, so-called. Now, you'll remember, before the First World War, there had basically been, three big social surveys. There'd been the work of Rowntree, there'd been the work by Booth, and there was the work of another man called Llewellyn Smith, who I didn't talk to you about. But basically, three big social surveys before the war. After the war, between 1918 and 1935, there are 156 social surveys conducted. Okay? So almost every area of social life becomes investigated and studied. Okay? There were studies of particular localities or of particular problems, whether it was health, housing, unemployment, malnutrition, poverty. But the logic, the tenor of all of them was to, rather like Booth and Rowntree, to expose deep social problems and find various solutions to them. And all of them basically sought to expose the failures of the old liberal political economy. The market and a lack of state intervention was not enough to solve these various social problems that they had identified. And therefore, into this space of recognizing that the laissez-faire and liberal political economy was no longer enough, came the new vogue for planning, for the planning of social and economic life. Now, it's been around for a while, but in a way, the idea of planning comes of age in response to the crisis of 1931. Okay? 1931, when Britain goes off free trade, goes off the gold standard, and such is the nature of the crisis that a national government is created, as it had been during the First World War, a cross-party national government. At this time, the journal, The Weekend Review, outlines what it calls for a new type of national plan. We've got to have a vision of how we get ourselves out of this mess. And it gives birth to a new organisation called PEP, Political and Economic Planning, PEP. Now, the idea of planning, in many ways, of course, came out of the example of Soviet Russia, whose 5-year plans had seemed to many people, not just those on the left, to have been an overriding success. Soviet Union had avoided the collapse of industries that had been the case in the Euro America. Okay? However, organizations like the Political Economic Planning, I want to emphasize, are basically cross-party and non-partisan. Okay? It had businessmen involved. There are a group of about 5 key figures that I'm just going to run through for you. Israel Seif, the director of Marks and Spencer's, the big retail outlet in the UK. The journalist and editor of Weekend Review, Gerald Barry. 2 scientists, significantly, Julian Huxley and Max Nicholson. Max Nicholson was a journalist, actually. I'm not quite sure why I've got him down here as a scientist. Huxley is the person who is a biologist, goes on to found the World Wildlife Fund. And Katie's beloved friend, Leonard Elmhirst, who goes on to set up a social experiment in Devon called Dartington Hall. These people, across the political spectrum, not partisan, believed then that planning was a scientific response to the economic and social chaos, that you could plan your way out and that you could do so in a way which was above politics. Okay? You could create a new science of government. And in many ways, the London School of Economics continues to be at the heart of these types of thought experiments. William Beveridge, who you'll remember, was the man who'd set up labour exchanges before the First World War and had introduced rationing during the First World War, became the director of the LSE in 1919 through to 1937. Beveridge, who you see here, goes on to play the key role in the planning of the welfare state during the early 1940s. Okay, so what you have here, I'm suggesting to you, is the beginning of a process that would lead to the creation of a radically different form of political and social organization. And I'll give you one other example of this, I think, which is of town planning. Okay, I can do this pretty quickly. Last week I talked to you about the vogue of people to live going into the countryside. I talked to you about the Council for the Protection of Rural England being worried about the degree to which the countryside was being lost through unplanned provision of housing. The type of urban sprawl that you see here in this aerial photograph of Bromley and Kent, where settlements built out alongside arterial routes. Many people believe that the public housing estates and the private developers had created a type of social fragmentation. They had built without thinking.